And I invite James Bullock, so from the UK Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. So he's going to tell us something more about the BESMAP project. So from regional case studies to European policy recommendation.
Yes, good morning, everyone, if it's still morning, maybe
Nope.
not. Yes, I'm James Bullock, and I'm going to present a talk which is in two parts, really. One is how we go from the case studies we used in BESMAP to the whole of Europe. There's a question asked about that earlier. And the second part is policy recommendations, so based on, well, I'll describe those in a minute. So part one, scaling up from case studies to the whole of Europe. So I think as Tomasz showed, these case studies give us a great deal of detailed knowledge and context-specific knowledge to understand impacts of agri-environment schemes and the socio-ecological drivers. And I think well, to my mind, it really showed that we need that local, regional scale understanding in order to look at both the ecological outcomes, the environmental outcomes, but also what's driving farmers in their decision making. These were 5 case studies. Of course, if we covered the whole of Europe with case studies, that would be probably the whole of the Horizon Europe budget, well, a large chunk of it anyway. So that's really, really expensive to do. So how can we transfer findings from case studies, our case studies, to other parts of Europe? And if we were to do BESMAP or something like it again, how might we target future case studies most effectively? This fancy diagram just shows the process flow which is behind all of this. You don't really need to take that home with you. So how do we go from case studies to the whole of Europe? Well, we developed we put a lot of thought into this over the years and a lot of discussion about the ways to do it. And we basically came up with this approach. So number one, we need to understand how similar different parts of Europe are to other parts of Europe, or in the case of BESMAP, how similar each part of Europe is to the case studies. And by similarity, we mean in terms of environmental, but also socioeconomic variables. And we do this by getting data on which is available across the whole of Europe. You can see that what's called parameter here, environmental data, but also at the bottom, data from the FADN database describing the things which Tomasz talked about. And using this, we can ask how similar, we sort of use something called a distance metric. It's not a geographical distance, it's like I guess you'd call it statistical distance of, in terms of important parameters or important variables. And we can use that to, for various reasons, we divided up Europe into the NUTS3 regions. This is why you can see this rather, you may disagree, that's a map of Europe, but it's a map which has of the part of the world which is covered by NUTS3 regions. We can take every NUTS3 region and look at its distance to every case study region. So that's what these two maps show. One is using one of the case study regions in Serbia and using just environmental variables saying how similar every other part of Europe is to that. The second map on the right is actually including the socioeconomic variables. I think... No, sorry, it's just the environmental variables, not the socioeconomic ones. That'll be the next one. And this is the difference of every part of Europe to one of the Spanish or Catalonian case studies. After the Macedonia comment, I'm probably prefer to Catalonia rather than Spain, but maybe not. Who knows? I'll probably offend someone. Being British, I probably will anyway. The second part, we want to be able to transfer our models. But as Tomasz explained, these models are created using local data for the case studies. So what we've done here is create what are called meta models, which is a fancy way of saying we create a statistical model of our predicted process model outcomes. And this, in this case, is a simple linear regression approach, which is shown here. And we do it using Europe-wide data, so I just showed you in the previous graph. So basically, if we get a model, which is a good predictor of the ecosystem service or biodiversity in the case study, using these Europe-wide data sets, we hope we can then We can then basically run that model anywhere in Europe. And the next question is, how do we know whether it's going to work there? We use the Minkowski distance approach. And as I said, we use Europe-wide data for environmental variables. There's a lot of that around, and the farm-level data for agri-environment schemes, economic size, and that should be farm specialization from the FADN data. It's a synthetic data approach. I won't go into details because it's far too complicated and I don't even understand it. What we do then is construct what we call transferability diagrams, which shows in the graph here on the x-axis is that distance, the environmental plus economic distance of every case study NUTS3 region from every other one. So there are 5 case studies. We divide them into NUTS3 regions. That gives us 19. So the difference, Minkowski distance of all other 18 NUTS3 regions to our target one, this one, a Serbian one again. And then we run that model, that meta model within each of those case study regions. And there we have, we actually have the predicted ecosystem service and biodiversity values. So we can say, how well does that meta model predict the real model outcomes? And it gives us an R squared, a measure of how much variance is explained. And our hypothesis here was as you get further away, environmentally and socioeconomically, your ability to transfer the models will be less. And that's exactly what's shown in this diagram. So as that distance gets more, the accuracy of the meta model decreases. And we found that in many cases. Some cases it's a bit flat, so we didn't use those. But basically this gives us a way of knowing where we can transfer our models to. And this is what we've shown here. So we came up with some criteria. Basically, the Minkowski distance can be, I'll just go back a bit. If it will work, maybe it won't work. If the Minkowski distance, we say if the R, use a threshold R squared of 0.5, see what the Minkowski distance is on that graph and use that to say that's a good transferability criteria. So we basically say how many times which models can we transfer to which other parts of Europe? And this shows that. So we have, as I said, 19 meta-models from the NUTS3 regions in our case studies. And this shows a map, the darker blue are NUTS3 regions where we can transfer more of our case study models, or models from more of our case studies, I should say. And this shows just for our nitrogen retention ecosystem service. And this is using just environmental variables. And it shows there are some fairly pale parts of Europe as a whole and some darker parts. So it gives us a good objective criteria for how we can transfer our models. If we include the economic data, the FADN data, we can also go even further. And this is a very important approach because that gives us information on agri-environment scheme uptake, etc. What we have here are these grey shaded areas where we have no FADN data. This is for the food ecosystem services, food and forage production. So this is very quickly running through that idea, how we go from these case studies to whole of Europe. The other question here for the upscaling was, if we wanted to do some new case studies, if we had BestMap 2 or something like that, where might we do them? Well, this is a bit complicated to explain, haven't much time, but basically, using this Minkowski distance, we clustered our NUTS3 regions across Europe into more similar in terms of Minkowski distance. And then we asked which of those clusters showed poor transferability from our existing case study areas. So the coloured NUTS3 regions here are those which met the transferability criteria less than 5 times, and probably the outlined and the more important ones, those are ones which we have really poor transferability from existing case studies. We excluded Turkey here. Hopefully that's not controversial, being not part of the EU, although we didn't include UK, thank God. So you can see there are various parts, especially in more southern Europe, where new case studies might be better to be put if there was a new BestMap. So that's how we do upscaling. I'm going to concentrate mostly now on the second part, Now for something completely different, to quote Monty Python. European policy recommendations. So we gathered lots of information, lots of understanding, talking to farmers, trying to understand ecosystem services across the EU. So we used this to come up with, probably rashly, maybe not policy recommendations, but policy thoughts, I should call them. So the first set of questions are about why do we think agri-environment schemes are currently insufficient to support biodiversity and ecosystem services in Europe. And there are 4 areas here, and I'll break those down in the next few slides. So I think, as Tomasz has said, and maybe one or two of the other speakers, the adoption of agri-environment schemes is insufficient. We found, and others have found, there's only a modest percentage of farmers implementing agri-environment. And even when they do, they tend to take up only a small proportion or small range of the options that are available. And especially the more ambitious agri-environment schemes that might deliver better on biodiversity or ecosystem services tend not to be taken up. Farmers have told us, and farmers have told many other people as well, there's too much bureaucratic effort in application reporting, and this seemed to especially push the smaller farmers away from agri-environment schemes. Farmers also reported either a lack of advisory services, or they felt there was confusing advice as well. They also felt there's a lack of flexibility, and that even in some cases where they're being asked to do things which to their minds make no sense in their context. So it sort of, again, pushes people away. And we've heard lots of times, not enough financial incentive to adopt agri-environment. The second area is that to do with where farmers, if they do agri-environment, where they put them. And we found, and again, this builds on previous work, that farmers tend to not place the options where it's best for biodiversity or ecosystem services, but where it maybe has least impact on productivity or is most beneficial economically. So often we find farmers reporting they're putting agri-environments on the least productive parts of their fields or in the least productive fields. Even some say they've accepted subsidies for measures they were doing already or which they're thinking of doing. So it's, I don't know if you know the English expression, money for old rope. You're paying for something which you'd have got anyway. There's a general reluctance to adopt measures in-field. I think Tomasz had a nice picture earlier of an in-field thing. They'll often do field margin approaches, as you can see here. And also, the farmers tend to prefer reversible short-term agri-environment, which means if food prices go up, say, they can revert. So again, it's very much the economics rather than any other drivers. And I think, again, this is sort of summing up what Tomasz talked about. I think is what is not less widely recognised is ecological trade-offs are common, especially when it comes to biodiversity. Biodiversity is not just one thing. It's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of species across Europe. So what we found, while we find some significant positive effects for some agri-environment schemes, such as buffer areas, extensive grassland maintenance, and maybe some types of birds like open grassland breeders, other agri-environment options have inconsistent effects, such as cover crops or organic farming. And also, there are different species which have different habitat preferences, as Tomasz talked about. So you can't just say one agri-environment scheme does this for biodiversity. They're all having different responses. And it actually was touched on as a question, maybe these ecological benefits need longer periods to accumulate, so which goes against that short-term idea.
So if you can conclude, sorry.
Blimey. I've only had 15 minutes.
Anyway.
Well, I've still got a few to go through. 10 minutes?
Maybe less.
All right. Okay. I haven't got onto the positives, the policy recommendations. And also, as we've talked about, a lack of monitoring and data hinders policy improvement. So farmers do know some agri-environment schemes are not effective, but they're a source of income. And we do need data, much better quality data, especially for biodiversity, fine-grained data to allow us to fit these models. And this actually prevents the scenario analysis that was touched on earlier. And so I'm going to speed up now. So let's get on to the positive. What are the solutions? 7, which I'll do quickly. So we feel we need to do better regional and national land use framework coordination. So not just CAP, but obviously many policies are impacting land use. You can see a list of them here. So we really need some sort of regional and national land use frameworks to really understand what we want to get from the land, where and why. And that's certainly being talked about in the UK at the moment, and it's something obviously the EU needs to think about. And there are some good experiences. Scotland has a land use strategy which is developing partnerships across local and national stakeholders to develop these strategies. We should be able to improve spatial targeting of agri-environment. So building on this land use framework, maybe prioritise funding for different agri-environment scheme measures. Thomas talked about farm system archetype. Maybe that's a way of actually building a consistent one which allows us to allocate resources where the additionality, ecological additionality, is maximised rather than just where farmers prefer to do it. And also better use of models and data to identify landscape impact of local measures. And so we can add agri-environment where their marginal returns on biodiversity and ecosystem services is maximised. Co-design is, I'm not sure has really been talked about yet today, but this seems to be a really important area. So obviously agri-environment schemes need to be better adapted to local environmental and farming conditions. And in our interviews, farmers say they want more autonomy and argue they could do it better. So let's let them do it. Let's work with farmers to actually get some better schemes in place and value their values and experiences with well-studied co-design processes, which we hope would increase buy-in, trust in government schemes, and adoption. So it relates to what's been happening recently in Brussels. So there's a big disconnect there. So in the UK, or actually in England, we have a new landscape recovery scheme, which is doing that sort of thing and also delivering economies of scale. I'm going to speed up now. I can see Gabriella twitching behind me. Improving advice to farmers. As I said, farmers, as Thomas said and others, they feel overwhelmed with bureaucratic load and that it's difficult to find agri-environment options that fit their farm management routine. And advisory services can help with that and with spatial targeting, etc. But there's a real variety and variation. They need to be knowledgeable and trusted. And there's a bit of a suspicion about private companies with their interest influencing advisors, where government-funded services might be a better way of doing it, and certainly something in the UK we've lost a long time ago. Payment for public goods rather than for just doing agri-environment, and it's touched on cost incurred or income forgone, is probably not enough. So what we find is in private funded schemes, apparently, maybe some examples in England, higher payments have been a significant driver for much bigger uptake by farmers. So one approach would be going for public money, for public goods. We can probably talk a lot about how we might do that. I won't go into WTO rules because that's probably a bit of a rabbit hole. Couple more slides. Better monitoring. We said there's poor evidence for impact of agri-environment schemes on various ecosystem services, on soil carbon especially. There is a potential to both use new technologies, but also linking, sort of what we talked about with agriculture now, linking these different data sets in a good way, but also going out to these soil testing labs, water companies, etc., to getting hold of those data in some way or form. And farmers tend to find would be happy to deploy and support new technologies and have some role in all of this. So this could be 20 minutes, but I won't do that. We've come up with this idea, which is probably a straw man idea just to throw out there. Maybe we need a better policy cycle to achieve these things. So at the moment, we have this top-down, 7-year cap renewal approach. We thought, given what we found in BestMap, we need something which is more adaptive, agile, and multi-scale. So this is, as I say, an idea. It's not saying this is how it should be. But basically, I'll go really rapidly through it. So we have, the blue circle is local, regional scale, adaptive cycle, where we have this co-design engagement with farmers about what they're doing on the ground, what is driving their decisions, what the outcomes are in terms of biodiversity and customer service outcomes, so we can have a fairly rapid cycle of effective learning and adaptive policy. But because the farmers evolved, it's not actually increasing their burden, so to speak. This could be embedded within a sort of national 7-year cycle, which is obviously what the current cap is, but at the national level, where we link with these national land use frameworks, which brings together what the cap, strategic plans, or whatever that would be in the future, but links with these bottom-up approaches and learning from those to actually say, do we need to change things fundamentally, or can we carry on the same route? Then maybe at the European scale, we can have a much longer policy cycle, say 14 years for the sake of argument, which allows us to actually better understand what's happening, what are the positives, what are the negatives, and what are the learnings from these more local scale approaches. And I could go into great detail about this, but I'll finish or else Gabriella will rugby tackle me off the stage. Okay, that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes for some questions. So please raise your hand if you have one. Oh, Tassos, you are the first one. Tassos is the first one? Well,
now you're first. Now I'm first. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I would like to go back, not necessarily in slides, in the concept, this distance concept that you have.
Uh-huh.
Now, the distance concept is a distance between a certain practice and not necessarily a best practice. It's a distance in Spain, in Serbia, a certain model that you have analyzed. If we were to assume that we have a best practice based on a certain characteristic from the 7 or 8 you have identified, let's say soil content, is it possible to identify this distance from this best practice on a map across Europe looking for the same characteristic, or it would be too difficult?
I think it would. So the distance at the moment is sort of agnostic in a sense. It's saying what is the environment, temperature, precipitation, soil types, etc. What are the farmers doing, agri-environment, what's their farm size, economic size, etc. This link to the models could be a way of actually saying what's the best practice within this type of, I guess those clusters I showed at the end, which this type, grouping of types of farms and landscapes, etc. So you could do that. We haven't, but you could say, well, let's run the models, what's the best possible thing to do there? So you could apply that. So you could do a sort of policy scenario analysis in that way, definitely, yeah. So yes, good idea.
we have someone else.
Thank you. I'm David Opatowski. I'm an agricultural attaché from Israel. I just wanted to say that looking at the recommendations you gave, I was pleased to see that you mentioned improved advice for farmers and they need to be knowledgeable and trusted. And I think, in a way, this is quite often the crux. I mean, we're talking all the time about improved technologies and all these environmental programs, etc. And the problem is not so much the research and what is out there, but implementing it down to the farmers. Now, when you have a state-run extension service or advisory service, then they are much more trusted than, let's say, private ones. They can put model farms, they can take farmers to other farmers where they're implementing environmental schemes, etc., and show them that it's working and that there's no loss of finance. They can provide financial support for beginning of programs. They can do regional IPM programs. The issue of state-run extension services, I think, is quite important, and I was wondering, what your thoughts about that is, and perhaps that is part of something which maybe now during this transitional period when Europe has to change to more environmentally friendly and putting in these new technologies, perhaps this is more needed than ever before.
Yes, I mean, I would basically just agree with all of that. Work with InvestMap and work I've done in Britain before just shows that advice is really, really important, to both as a sort of two-way process, both to help farmers know what's going on, but also to listen to farmers saying, well, I would do that, but there's this problem. But the advisor can say, well, actually, you could do this to get around it. So there's that two-way process. And there's many benefits, not just the immediate on-the-ground ones, but the buy-in, the feeling of being trusted and being able to make their own decisions is really important. And I think many countries, well, Britain certainly has lost many years ago the state-run advisory service, and that's a real loss. We did try with what's called ELMS in England now, try to push having that come back in, but I think governments tend to see as it's too expensive. But I agree. I think the outcomes, you're much more likely to get the outcomes you want by having those middle people to do that. So I would agree with all of those. So, yeah.
We have time for one final question. Who bids? I have two people here, but you're close. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry for that. Xavier Leprince, I am from Lille University, Catholic University in France. What would be your recommendation to extend communication to other stakeholders, such as consumers, supermarkets, food players? Because what we have seen in the streets, motorways, centers of the towns, that farmers are also asking for more understanding of what they do, but they cannot get a living out of that. So would you recommend, as compared to the extension and to the advisory system we have in place, to go further in communication of the benefits?
That's a really good point. I'm just responding off the cuff here. I mean, maybe it's my politics, but I tend to think that's a role for government. And I think governments too often step back from that role. I mean, in Britain we have this idea of the nanny state, telling people what to do. And that's but really, I think that's the role. I mean, scientists like me can produce stuff, and we can outreach and whatever, but there's a very limited audience. It's the governments who can set down these thoughts and communication tools and wider publicization to help with those things. And I think that would help disinformation, but also the positive stories about that actually, in this case, agriculture that's sustainable for the environment, for climate change, etc., is good for us all. It's a no-brainer, but it seems to be out there for debate. So governments need to step up.
Thank you very much, James. I think it was a great presentation.